Things have a funny way of coming full circle, don't they? Here I am, sipping tea, proper tea, mind you, and thinking about how I ended up fighting in a war for a country I'd only just met. It's like going to someone's house for dinner and suddenly being asked to help rebuild their kitchen. Though between you and me, I've got a theory about why they picked us immigrants for the draft so quickly. We asked fewer questions about the food. I arrived in New York in '65, fresh off the boat from Yorkshire, with 2 suitcases and enough tea to last a year, or so I thought. Lasted barely a month. Actually, Americans and their curious obsession with ice in everything. But that's a conspiracy for another day. 3 years. That's all it took. 3 years of learning to say apartment instead of flat, of trying to understand why baseball was called a World Series when only Americans played it, of working at my uncle's bookshop in Brooklyn. Then that draft notice arrived. Mrs. Rosenstein, my landlady, bless her soul, she brought it up herself, reading it 3 times through her thick glasses as if the words might change. "Geoffrey," she said, patting my hand, "maybe this is how you become a real American." She made me sugar cookies that night, which I suppose was her version of a Last Supper. American kindness always came with butter and sugar, I'd noticed. Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Now there's a peculiar slice of American life, ever there was one. The humidity was like walking through soup, and the drill sergeant seemed personally offended by my accent. But that's where I met Jimmy Sullivan, and that's when everything changed. Picture this, I'm struggling with these ridiculous boots, 2 sizes too big, mind you, looking like Charlie Chaplin trying to walk a tightrope. This lanky fellow with bright red hair and a face full of freckles walks up, cool as you please, and says, well, would you look at that? Even your boots have a British accent. That was Jimmy. Always ready with a quip, always finding humour in the chaos. Jimmy was Minnesota born and raised, but his soul was from everywhere and nowhere. Had this way of making you feel like you belonged, even when everything around you was screaming that you didn't. He taught me American idioms between push-ups. "No, Geoffrey," he'd say, "while we're both covered in South Carolina mud, it's a piece of cake. Not piece of pie. You're in America now, buddy. We supersize everything, including our metaphors." Basic training was, well, imagine trying to learn how to be an American while simultaneously learning how to be a soldier. Jimmy made it bearable. He had this theory that the army chose South Carolina for basic training because the humidity would prepare us for Vietnam. They're boiling the Englishman right out of you, Geoff. He'd say, during our endless marches. Then came Vietnam, Kochi to be precise. If South Carolina was soup, Vietnam was like living in a kettle that's perpetually almost boiling. The air was thick enough to chew, and the nights were filled with sounds that no amount of training could prepare you for. First week in country, Jimmy developed this routine. Every night, he'd take out this little notebook and write down 3 things. Something that almost killed him, something that made him laugh, and something he missed about home. Keeping perspective, he called it. Sometimes the same thing would end up in all 3 categories. We were assigned to the 25th Infantry Division, doing mostly patrol work, walking through villages, trying to tell fighters from farmers, friends from foes. The Vietnamese children, they found me fascinating. Here was this pale chap with a British accent wearing an American uniform in their country. Jimmy said I was probably causing some poor kid an existential crisis. The villagers and we had an understanding of sorts. We both spoke English as a second language, both trying to navigate American expectations. Sometimes they'd help me with Vietnamese phrases, and I helped them with English ones. Jimmy found this hilarious. "Look at you," he'd say, "conducting international diplomacy while I'm still trying to figure out how to ask where the bathroom is. But war has a way of shifting things. One day you're trading language lessons and cigarettes. The next you're scanning rooftop, jumping at shadows. Jimmy kept our spirits up, though, had this way of making even the darkest moments lighter. You know what the real problem with this war is? Geoffrey. He'd say during particularly harrowing patrols, the marketing, they should have called it extreme East Asian camping with complimentary fireworks. We developed all sorts of little rituals to keep sane. Sunday letters, him to his girl Sarah back in Minnesota, me to Danielle, a girl I had met in high school. She told me she loved me. She never replied any of my letters, and I never saw her ever again. He called our situation Romeo and Juliet meets Bond, but with worse catering. Every third day, we'd trade portions of our rations. He'd take my chocolate bar. I'd take his coffee, though I still maintain that what the army called coffee would be considered a war crime in any civilized nation. October 12th, 1968. I remember the date because Jimmy had just finished telling me about his plans for after the war. He wanted to open a comedy club in Minneapolis. Imagine it. Geoffrey, he said, I'll call it The Last Laugh. You can be the sophisticated British opener, warming up the crowd with observations about American tea habits. We were on patrol near a village called Trang Bang. Everything seemed normal, well, as normal as anything ever was in that green hell. The morning mist was just starting to burn off. And Jimmy was doing his impression of President Johnson ordering breakfast. He had this theory that powerful men be judged by how they treated waitstaff. And he'd created this whole elaborate scenario about Johnson demanding his eggs be served over easy, just like my foreign policy. The first shot came from somewhere to our left. Then all hell broke loose. It's strange the things you remember from moments like that. I remember the smell of wet earth, the way the sunlight was breaking through the trees in patches, the sound of Jimmy's last laugh, because of course he was laughing. Even then, even in that moment, he found something darkly funny about it all. Hey, Geoffrey, he called out as we dove for cover. Think this will make a good story for my club opening. Those were his last words, not some grand statement about democracy or freedom. Not a message for Sarah or his mother, just Jimmy finding humour in the darkness right until the end. The official report said the firefight lasted 12 minutes. 12 minutes that changed everything. A sniper's bullet found him just as he was reloading. One moment he was there, that bright spark of life and humour, and the next he wasn't. You know what's truly strange? After all these years, I still catch myself thinking of things to tell him. Some odd American custom I've finally understood, or a new theory about why tea tastes different on this side of the Atlantic. It took me 17 years to visit his grave at Arlington. 17 years of carrying around stories I couldn't tell him. But here's what I learned from Jimmy Sullivan, something I've carried with me all these years through all my adventures. Life isn't about where you're from. It's about where you choose to stand. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is find light in the darkness. Find humour in the pain. Find home in the strangest of places. Jimmy taught me that being an American isn't about how you say tomato or whether you understand baseball. It's about choosing to stand for something, even when you're still figuring out exactly what that something is. He showed me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and finding a reason to laugh anyway. Though I should mention that Jimmy also had this elaborate theory about how the entire Cold War was actually orchestrated by Swiss bankers to sell more chocolate. Think about it, Geoffrey, he'd say. When people are stressed, they eat more sweets. Who makes the best chocolate? The Swiss. Who stays neutral in every conflict? The Swiss. Coincidence? I think not. You know, sometimes I wonder if he wasn't onto something with that theory. Have you ever noticed how many world leaders have Swiss bank accounts? Makes you think, doesn't it? But that's the thing about life, and death for that matter. It's rarely about the big moments that make the history books. It's about the small ones, the shared laugh, the borrowed cigarettes, the late-night conversations about Swiss chocolate conspiracies and the proper way to make tea. So here's to you, Jimmy Sullivan. You helped an Englishman become an American, taught me that home is where you choose it to be, and showed me that even war, perhaps especially in war, there's always room for one last laugh. Though between you and me, I'm still not putting ice in my tea. Some principles are worth dying for, and proper tea preparation is one of them. Jimmy would have appreciated that stance. Right after making a joke about my colonial stubbornness, I'm Geoffrey Softmouth. Good day to you all.